Right, welcome to another SY3 screencast, and in this presentation we're going to examine the role of political parties. And there are basically three areas that we're going to work through. Firstly, we're going to start by explaining what political parties are. Secondly, we're going to look at what the point of political parties is. We're going to look at their role within a representative democracy. And in the final part of the presentation, we'll look at whether or not the role of political parties in British democracy is currently in decline. So let's start with a concise definition that you can use in an exam question about the role of political parties. And we can define a political party as a group of people organised for the purpose of winning government power through elections. Now, students sometimes confuse political parties with pressure groups or social movements. And I'm going to suggest that there are four main features of political parties that distinguish them from other types of political groups. Firstly, as political parties are aiming to win government power through election, represented by this ballot box, political parties, unlike pressure groups and social movements, put up candidates in elections. Secondly, political parties are organised bodies with a formal card-carrying membership, and this distinguishes political parties from some of the newer internet-based pressure groups like UK Uncut that we've seen emerge in recent years, and it also distinguishes political parties from broader and more diffuse social movements. Thirdly, unlike pressure groups, political parties tend to have quite a broad focus. So certainly the mainstream political parties will develop manifestos that encompass a broad variety of policy issues, unlike pressure groups that tend to focus on a particular group or a single issue. And finally, whilst the members of pressure groups or social movements might share very little in common apart from membership of a particular group or commitment to one particular issue, the members of political parties, to some extent, are united by shared policy preferences and a shared political ideology. So traditionally the Labour Party has been ideologically the main left-of-centre political party in Britain. The Conservative Party has been the main right-of-centre political party in Britain traditionally, and the Liberal Democrats have occupied the middle ground. Interestingly, many commentators would argue that the whole party political spectrum in the UK, Labour on the left, Lib Dems in the centre, the Conservatives on the right, has shifted to the right in recent years within the UK. And this has meant that people with political ideologies that once would have been regarded as being on the centre or on the centre-left and now sometimes derided as having loony left political views in sections of the right-wing media. And one of the negative consequences of the political parties shifting towards the right is the perception that there is very little in the way of meaningful choice in British party politics. And this is perhaps one of the main reasons that we've seen a decline in turnout in recent UK general elections. So according to survey data compiled by the British Election Study, the main reason given for non-voting in UK general elections is the perception that there's very little in the way of choice, that the main political parties are perceived to be too similar. Right, let's move on to this second question, which is about the role of political parties. In other words, what is the point of political parties in a representative democracy? Stephen Fielding argues that political parties are an essential feature of representative democracies because they perform one vital function that no other political group can effectively perform. And this is the idea that political parties aggregate interests. And what this means is that political parties draw together the millions of frankly incoherent desires and interests that exist within the electorate and shape these interests into a more coherent programme of government. And single issue groups, even though they're becoming much more popular in our democracy, can't really perform this particular function because they have a much narrower focus. It takes political parties that have a broader focus to aggregate interests. As the Liberal politician Herbert Samuels argued in 1945, without political parties to organise them, the electorate becomes a mob. However, even though Stephen Fielding argues that political parties are an indispensable feature of representative democracy, he also admits that there's a growing perception within Britain that the people who run the main political parties are increasingly seen as a remote, semi-distant political elite. In other words, they're increasingly seen as being out of touch with mainstream public opinion. And this leads us on to the last part of our presentation, where we're going to look at whether or not the role of political parties is actually in decline. And there seems to be ample evidence at the moment that political parties in Britain, or at least the mainstream political parties, are experiencing a crisis of legitimation. And this is the idea that there's been a collapse of trust in the mainstream political parties in Britain. If you look at the stories about political parties in Britain at the moment, they tend to be very, very negative, involving allegations of sleaze, scandal, corruption, political lobbyists. This all feeds into this crisis of legitimation. And Jerry Stoker argues that a key feature of British politics at the moment is that large numbers of citizens are alienated from its mainstream practices. And he refers to this mood as anti-politics, and the phenomenon of anti-politics finds expression through a strong negative outlook towards the main political parties. And one political party that is a beneficiary of this anti-politics mood at the moment is the UK Independence Party, who have positioned themselves as an alternative to the mainstream political parties. So UKIP have harnessed a kind of protest vote against the mainstream political parties. And of course, one of the consequences of this anti-politics mood has been a complete collapse in party membership. So we look at the Conservative Party in 1950, it had close to 3 million members, and we can see how over time that has fallen into steep decline. So it's probably around about 200,000 now. And we see a similar pattern of decline if we look at the other two main political parties. And this crisis of legitimation in the mainstream political parties is also arguably leading to growing support and involvement in new social movements and single-issue campaign groups that often use direct action and that operate outside of the formal institutions and practices of politics. And this seems to be particularly the case with younger members of society.